I remember that day as if it were carved into my memory with sharp edges. The afternoon sunlight spilled through the living room windows, catching the dust motes that danced lazily in the air. My baby, barely 6 months old, was perched in my arms, bundled in a soft pastel blanket that smelled faintly of lavender. I could feel the warmth of her tiny body, the gentle rise and fall of her chest with each breath. There was a softness to the moment, a quiet, ordinary peace, until it shattered. We were gathered at my in-laws' house for a casual Sunday lunch. At least, that's what I had told myself to keep my nerves steady. My husband was in the kitchen, humming to himself as he prepared plates, and I had settled onto the floral-patterned sofa, cradling our daughter. Everyone else had already congregated around the dining table, clinking cutlery against plates, laughing at old stories. I was about to take a sip of my tea when it happened. She said it like it was nothing. Like commenting on the weather. Like it was the most natural observation in the world. She's not very pretty, is she? I froze. The words lingered in the air, hanging like smoke, curling into the corners of the room. I felt the baby stir in my arms, sensing something in the shift of my posture, the tension tightening in my chest. My fingers unconsciously tightened around her tiny shoulders. I looked up at her, my mother-in-law. She was sitting there, hair perfectly coiffed, lips curved in that small, satisfied smile she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. There was no malice in her eyes, at least not the kind you see in a cartoon villain. No, this was different. It was calm, subtle, precise, like a surgeon's scalpel meant to wound invisibly. She had trained herself over decades to cut without leaving a mark, or so she thought. The room went still. Not a single relative offered a word, though I could feel their eyes flicking between us, sensing the tension. It was one of those silences that presses against your ears, thick and suffocating. The baby gurgled, oblivious to the social earthquake that had just landed. I wanted to respond. I wanted to scream, to shake her by the shoulders and demand an apology, to protect my child from the venom I could already taste in the air. But I didn't. Instead, I felt something strange settle over me. A quiet, deliberate calm. I realized that if I reacted with anger, it would escalate. She thrived on chaos, on seeing her words turn into storms. If I reacted with tears, she would feel victorious, think she had won. No, I needed something else. Something measured, something that would stick. A single sentence that would speak louder than any outburst. I could feel it, forming in the back of my mind. Short, simple, surgical. Whisper of a sentence that would make her reconsider every smug little comment she had ever made about my child and perhaps even herself. I shifted slightly, adjusting the baby in my arms, feeling the weight of her tiny head against my chest. The warmth of her skin grounded me. I could feel the subtle pulse of her heartbeat, quickening slightly, responding to my own tension. I imagined the words leaving my mouth and landing in the space between us, silent but powerful. I imagined her expression changing, slowly, imperceptibly, until it betrayed the slightest flicker of regret, embarrassment, maybe even shame. And yet I held my tongue, not because I was afraid, but because I understood the gravity of the moment. Words, when wielded correctly, could be more devastating than any scream. The sentence hovered in my mind, a fragile thing, yet solid as stone. Around us, the world continued in muted tones. A distant laugh from the kitchen, the clatter of a spoon against a plate, the soft cooing of my daughter. But within the space of that room, time itself seemed suspended. Every second stretched, heavy with anticipation. I could see her glance shift slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward my face. There was a faint curiosity there, a subtle hunger for a reaction. I let my eyes meet hers, calm and unwavering. The baby wriggled slightly, reaching for my hair with tiny fists, pulling me into the present. I inhaled, the scent of lavender and baby lotion grounding me. The sentence was ready. It was precise. It was quiet, yet it would resonate. But I didn't speak just yet. I allowed the pause to stretch, letting the tension build naturally, letting her expectation hang like a fragile crystal in the air. I could feel my heart beating, slow but deliberate. I wasn't nervous. I was aware. Aware of the stakes, aware of the dynamic, aware of the history that had led to this moment. Because this wasn't the first time she had tried to undermine me. There had been small digs, subtle criticisms, sideways glances during family holidays, comments disguised as jokes, but nothing like this. This was deliberate. This was direct. And it was public. I knew in that suspended silence that the words I would choose now could either shatter the fragile balance in the room or restore it entirely. They could reveal the truth of who I was, who she was, and where the real power lay. I breathed slowly, feeling the soft rise and fall of my daughter's chest against mine, and let my mind settle. The sentence was simple, calm, unforgettable. It was a sentence that would carry weight far beyond this single moment, echoing into every conversation, every gathering, every future attempt to belittle her. And then I whispered it, but that part of the story, what I actually said, has to wait. Because if I tell you now, it loses its power. The anticipation, the silence, the weight of every unspoken word is what makes it unforgettable. So we pause here, at the edge of revelation, the moment before the storm breaks. The moment when a single sentence is enough to shift the course of a family dynamic forever. What would you do if someone looked at your child that way? If someone dared to diminish the tiny, perfect life in your arms? Would you shout, cry? Or like me, choose a calm that carries the force of justice in just one unforgettable line? The tension that day didn't appear out of nowhere. It was decades in the making, hidden in the folds of family history, buried beneath smiles and polite conversation. My mother-in-law, with her perfectly arched eyebrows and poised demeanor, had always carried an invisible ledger in her mind. Every compliment, every misstep, every fleeting thought about her children and grandchildren was cataloged, judged, and compared. And I, like so many others before me, had unwittingly stepped into her calculations. From the very beginning, subtle signs had made their presence known. When my husband was growing up, she had a way of shaping his world quietly, subtly favoring certain siblings over others. My husband often spoke of birthdays when his sister would receive the grandest gifts, while his own presence felt routine, expected, insufficient. He learned early that love was measured in attention, in curated praise, in the comparison of one child to another. And that pattern, that silent, toxic standard, had followed him into our marriage. When I first married into the family, I thought I could navigate the undercurrents. I believed that politeness, patience, and a kind heart would shield me from the sharp edges I sensed lurking beneath her smile. But she had a knack for testing boundaries, for seeing how far she could push without creating outright confrontation. I began to notice little things almost immediately, a comment about my cooking that carried more judgment than advice, a sigh at the mention of my career that suggested I was never quite enough, a subtle tilt of the head when I spoke that implied my words carried less weight than hers. At first, I tried to dismiss it. I told myself she was old-fashioned, that she simply had strong opinions. I smiled, I nodded. I offered small compliments in return, hoping to maintain harmony. But over time, a quiet unease began to settle in my chest. Each encounter left a residue, a lingering doubt, a whisper of insecurity that I didn't belong. Not in her world, not in the family she controlled so meticulously. The pattern extended inevitably to our child. From the moment my daughter was born, I noticed the subtle comparisons. Not outright cruelty at first, just comments that pricked like needles beneath the skin. "She's such a delicate baby. Are you sure she's healthy?" Or, "Oh, I hope she takes after her father. He was such a strong baby." Innocuous, perhaps, to anyone else, but to me, each remark carried the weight of judgment, the unspoken measure of worthiness. and beneath it all, a quiet thrill she seemed to take in monitoring my reactions. I reflected on these moments often, replaying them in my mind during the quiet hours of the night. I remembered the birthday last year when she had brought her own grandchildren to the party and lingered in the center of the room, directing attention with subtle gestures, orchestrating who got praise and who did not. I remembered the tiny digs disguised as compliments. "You've done so well for someone who never," or "oh, she's a beautiful baby, but..." Those ellipses were weapons. Those unfinished sentences carried more power than any explicit insult. And it wasn't just about me. It was about control. It was about shaping the narrative of the family, of deciding who was worthy of affection and admiration, and who was to be diminished. I saw it clearly now, looking back. The patterns that had always been there. Favoritism, envy, the subtle undermining of anyone who might challenge her authority or disrupt the carefully curated image of perfection she maintained. My husband, bless him, had grown up walking a tightrope. He had learned to placate to avoid confrontation, to smile through discomfort. And in doing so, he had developed a blind spot for her cruelty, a tolerance that sometimes left him unable to protect those he loved. I had to learn differently. I had to observe, to remember, to catalog not just her words, but the intention behind them, the silent weight of her presence. It was during those long reflections that I began to prepare myself. I imagined the moments ahead, family gatherings, holiday dinners, casual conversations that might veer toward judgment or insult. I rehearsed responses in my mind, subtle corrections, calm statements that could diffuse tension without escalating it. And yet nothing felt as important as protecting my child from the small, invisible wounds that words could inflict. Because children, even babies, sense energy. They feel judgment, the invisible tilt of disapproval, the tension that adults try to mask. I wanted my daughter to grow up wrapped in a shield of love, not subjected to the silent calculations of someone who measured worth by control. And I knew deep down that this shield couldn't be passive. It couldn't rely on others to uphold it. I had to wield it, carefully, deliberately, with calm precision. I also reflected on my own upbringing, and perhaps that sharpened my awareness. I had grown up in a household where love was conditional, where praise was measured, and where silence could be as cutting as any spoken insult. I knew how words could linger, how they could shape perception, self-worth, and identity. I could not allow my daughter to experience the same quiet torment. I would be vigilant. I would be measured. I would be deliberate. And so, as I cradled her that day, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, I realized that my mother-in-law's words, though cruel, were predictable. They followed a pattern. They carried the same undertone, the same subtle need to assert dominance, the same carefully calibrated sting. I knew she would escalate if given the opportunity. I knew she thrived on tension, on watching others squirm, on seeing the disruption she caused take root. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about my child, about creating a safe space, about drawing the line between protection and retaliation. I understood in that suspended moment that the calm sentence I had rehearsed in my mind wasn't just a defense. It was a declaration. A single line that would establish boundaries, assert authority, and reclaim dignity. And yet, I still didn't speak. Because even with all the preparation, all the reflection, all the awareness of patterns, there was a moment, a brief, fragile moment, when the weight of history and the tension of anticipation coalesced. That moment demanded stillness. That moment demanded clarity. That moment demanded patience. So I held my daughter a little closer, felt the warmth of her tiny body against mine, and waited. Because I knew the perfect time to speak would come. And when it did, it would be unforgettable. The tension that had been simmering quietly for years finally found a way to surface, as if it had been waiting for the perfect storm. It wasn't sudden, it never is. Betrayal rarely arrives like a lightning strike. It builds slowly, quietly, until the air itself seems charged with its inevitability. That day, the air in my mother-in-law's living room felt almost viscous, thick with expectation. Each conversation a subtle test, each glance a calculated maneuver. It began with small incidents, almost innocuous in isolation, but together they formed a pattern I had learned to recognize. During family dinners, she would comment on my parenting choices, seemingly in passing. "Oh, you've given her that toy already? I thought you were waiting." Or, "She's crying? Maybe she's just spoiled, don't you think?" I would offer a polite smile, a nod, internalizing the sting, weighing the right moment to respond. At first, I tried to ignore these micro-attacks, telling myself that restraint was the better part of wisdom. But over time, they became a constant, a low hum of judgment that never ceased. Even casual interactions were tinged with her quiet assessments. If I dressed my daughter in pink, she would remark, "Are you sure that suits her? Maybe something calmer would be better." If I chose a practical stroller, she would frown and say, "I remember the one I picked out for my first grandchild. It was much more elegant." The comments were small, almost imperceptible, but each one was designed to undermine, to assert dominance, to remind me subtly that I existed within her carefully measured world, not my own, and I watched the effect it had on the rest of the family. Some relatives laughed along, mistaking her criticisms for humor. Others glanced at me, unsure whether to intervene. I could feel the quiet fractures forming in the room, small fissures of doubt and discomfort that her words always left behind. Every time she spoke, I had to choose between engaging and rising to her bait, or maintaining calm and protecting my child's sense of security. I chose the latter, always the latter. But beneath the surface, my mind was never idle. I cataloged every comment, every sideways glance, every lingering smirk. I began to see the patterns more clearly. She thrived on creating doubt, on planting seeds of insecurity, on making herself the center of attention while diminishing those around her. I realized that confrontation would be inevitable. It was only a matter of timing. And when it came, it would have to be measured, precise, a surgical strike rather than an emotional outburst. The lead-up to the betrayal was subtle, almost theatrical in its pacing. There were warning signs everywhere: the extra attention to her own grandchildren, the careful arrangement of seating at family dinners, the tiny adjustments she made to control the flow of conversation. I watched as she positioned herself, always within arm's reach of the baby, always ready to interject, always ready to assert the dominance she so quietly craved. And then came the fateful Sunday lunch, the day when everything came to a head. I had dressed my daughter in her softest outfit, a little mint green romper with tiny embroidered flowers. Her tiny socks peeked from beneath, and I brushed her fine hair gently into place. I wanted her to feel comfortable, loved, secure. And as we arrived at my mother-in-law's house, I felt a nervous excitement, hoping for a peaceful visit, hoping for smiles rather than judgment. The house was warm, the smell of roasting chicken and fresh bread welcoming. Relatives were chatting quietly, some playing with the baby, others sipping tea and exchanging stories. I sat on the sofa, my daughter in my lap, feeling the steady rise and fall of her chest against my own. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to believe that perhaps this time would be different. But she was there, as always, moving with that practiced ease, surveying the room with the calm precision of someone who expected obedience, who expected attention, who expected compliance. And I could see it in her eyes. The calculation, the subtle gleam of anticipation, the tiny thrill of impending drama. She approached, leaning slightly over my daughter, smiling faintly, her tone deceptively gentle. "Oh, she's interesting," she said, tilting her head, as though testing the waters, feeling out my reaction. I felt the heat rise in my chest, the quiet hum of tension building in my veins. I held the baby closer, sensing the shift in the room. Every relative paused, catching the faint tremor in my posture, feeling the weight of the unspoken conflict. At that moment, all the small incidents, the subtle digs, the carefully measured criticisms coalesced into a single, undeniable fact. She was going to cross the line. I knew it. I felt it in my bones. And when she did, everything I had prepared, the calm sentence, the mental rehearsals, the careful patience, would finally be put to the test. And then it happened. She called it outright. There was no nuance, no testing the waters, no gentle prodding, just words, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the quiet hum of conversation. She's ugly, isn't she? The room went silent, the air thick with disbelief. I could feel the eyes of my relatives on me, some sympathetic, some shocked, some quietly calculating their own responses. My daughter, blissfully unaware, gurgled softly in my arms, reaching for my hair. And I realized in that suspended heartbeat that the moment I had anticipated for years had arrived. I inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of every past insult, every subtle manipulation, every quiet undermining that had led to this moment. I could feel my heart pounding, yet I kept my breathing even, my posture calm, my mind deliberate. This was the moment for which I had prepared. This was the moment when one calm sentence could shift the balance, could establish boundaries, could assert protection without raising my voice. I held my daughter a little closer, feeling her warmth, the tiny rhythm of her heartbeat against mine. I felt a sense of clarity settle over me. The betrayal had arrived, but I was ready. I was calm. I was deliberate. And I knew that what I was about to say would resonate far beyond the confines of this single room, far beyond the immediate sting of her words. The one sentence that had lived in my mind for months hovered there, waiting, precise, unforgettable. And now it was time. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. She's ugly, isn't she? The sentence was deliberate, calculated, and cruel. I could feel the baby stir in my arms, sensing the tension, sensing the weight of words that no child should ever hear. For a moment, everything slowed. The distant clatter of dishes, the faint hum of conversation from the kitchen, even the soft ticking of the wall clock seemed to fade away. All that existed was the space between me, my daughter, and the woman who had just dared to belittle her. I inhaled slowly, feeling the warmth of my baby against my chest, the tiny pulse of her heartbeat grounding me in the present. My hands, steady but firm, supported her head as I shifted slightly, allowing her to rest more securely against my shoulder. My eyes met my mother-in-law's, calm, unwavering, precise. The room felt suspended, every relative holding their breath, caught in the quiet tension that had become almost tangible. I could see it in her eyes, the faint flicker of expectation, the subtle anticipation that I would react. She was used to reactions, shouts, tears, defensive posturing. That was what she thrived on. But I had learned over years of subtle manipulation that power was not in the loudest voice, nor in the most immediate display of emotion. Power was in calm precision, in the deliberate choice of words that carried weight far beyond the moment. I paused. I let the silence stretch, allowing the tension to build naturally. I could feel the eyes of every family member on me, the weight of their anticipation, the curiosity mingled with disbelief. I felt the baby's tiny hand brush against my chin, grounding me further, reminding me why this moment mattered so profoundly. And then I spoke. The words were simple, calm, surgical. Her worth isn't yours to measure, I whispered them softly, deliberately, but the impact was immediate. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the taut air finally loosening, if only slightly. My mother-in-law froze, mid-sentence, her lips parting slightly as if she were struggling to comprehend what had just been said. The carefully constructed veneer of control she had relied upon for decades cracked in that instant. Her eyes flickered, a subtle but undeniable mixture of surprise, embarrassment, and something I almost dared to recognize as shame. No shouting. No tears, no dramatic outburst. Just a calm, unyielding declaration that established boundaries with precision. In that one sentence, I had reclaimed authority, protected my child, and exposed the inadequacy of her cruelty. The words resonated with a quiet force, a subtle justice that required no theatrics to be effective. The baby gurgled, oblivious to the storm that had just passed. I felt a gentle shift in my chest, a sense of relief mingled with pride. I had defended her without raising my voice, without stooping to anger, without allowing the situation to escalate. In that quiet victory, there was a profound satisfaction, a sense of justice that felt both ancient and immediate. I observed the subtle changes in the room. My husband, standing near the doorway, his eyes wide with surprise, seemed to register the shift. The relatives who had been quietly observing exchanged glances, some relieved, some impressed, some quietly reconsidering their previous alliances. Even my mother-in-law's posture altered, slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to betray her internal acknowledgement that she had miscalculated. She attempted a response, a faintly sarcastic remark, but it faltered. The sentence had struck precisely where it needed to, piercing through her habitual defenses. I maintained eye contact, calm and unwavering, refusing to allow her a foothold to continue her manipulation. The moment was delicate, balanced on the edge of reaction and restraint, yet I held it perfectly. I reflected on why this sentence worked. It was simple, yes, but its simplicity was its power. It didn't insult, it didn't provoke, it didn't stoop to her level. Instead, it asserted a principle, one that was undeniable, unassailable. It declared that my child's worth, my child's value, could not be diminished by another's envy or malice. It drew a line, one that could not be crossed, and it did so without theatrics, without drama, with absolute clarity. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange, muted calm. Conversations resumed, though with a subtle shift in tone. There was an unspoken awareness that a boundary had been established, that the quiet balance of power had shifted. My mother-in-law's attempts at casual criticism were met with polite but firm resistance, her carefully measured digs less effective than before. She had tasted briefly the weight of words wielded with precision, and had found them more powerful than any scream or protest could ever be. I spent the rest of the day holding my daughter close, reflecting on the experience. The calm sentence whispered in the eye of the storm had achieved what years of subtle negotiation could not. It had established respect, protected innocence, and delivered a quiet justice that resonated far beyond the immediate moment. And I realized, in that stillness, that confrontation did not have to be loud to be effective. There was strength in calm, in measured words, in deliberate action. There was power in choosing the moment carefully, in delivering truth with precision, in protecting those we love with unwavering clarity. As evening fell, the house quieted and the family slowly dispersed. I held my daughter a little closer, feeling the gentle weight of her small body against mine. I reflected on what had just transpired, the betrayal, the tension, the anticipation, and finally, the resolution achieved through calm authority. It was a moment that would linger in my memory, a turning point not just in that single afternoon, but in the ongoing dynamics of my family. The sentence had established a boundary that could not be erased, a quiet assertion of justice that would shape future interactions. And in that clarity, there was a profound sense of satisfaction, a quiet triumph that needed no applause to be recognized. I looked at my daughter, her eyes bright and innocent, and felt a renewed determination to protect her from the subtle cruelties that can hide behind smiles and polite conversation. I knew the path ahead would not always be easy, that the challenges of family dynamics would continue, but this moment had shown me that calm, deliberate action could wield a power far greater than anger or confrontation. And I wondered, quietly as I watched her drift to sleep in my arms, what others would have done in my place. Would they have reacted with anger? With tears? With shouting? Or would they have found the same quiet surgical precision that had allowed me to defend the most important life in my world with nothing more than a single unforgettable sentence? The moment the words left my lips, the immediate storm passed, but the ripples spread far beyond the room. Family gatherings would never feel the same again. Some relatives, previously silent, now glanced at my mother-in-law with a new awareness, a quiet recognition that her authority was not absolute, that her manipulations could be checked, and that her words no longer carried the weight they once had. Others lingered in uncomfortable curiosity, unsure how to react or what allegiance to take. And my husband, standing quietly nearby, looked at me with a mixture of awe, relief, and perhaps for the first time, true understanding of the silent burden I had carried through these years. In the days that followed, the fallout began in subtle ways. She whispered to relatives in private, crafting narratives of misinterpretation, attempting to reclaim the upper hand. She hinted that I had overreacted, that my calm statement had been a dig, an insult disguised as righteousness. I heard through soft murmurs and carefully intercepted conversations that her frustration was palpable. It was almost poetic, the woman who had spent years orchestrating perception, now powerless to control mine. I remained calm. I refused to chase gossip or respond to half-truths. I had already said what needed to be said, in the manner that mattered most. Every attempt she made to spin the narrative faltered, because the truth was anchored not in emotion but in principle. My daughter's worth was hers alone, and no amount of manipulation could diminish it. I noticed subtle shifts in family dynamics in the weeks that followed. Relatives who had once deferred to her judgment now approached interactions with caution, mindful of her influence but aware that it was no longer absolute. Conversations began to include my voice, my perspective, my careful, deliberate reasoning. The respect I had quietly commanded in that one afternoon grew steadily, imperceptibly at first, but undeniably over time. There were moments of tension, of course. She would occasionally attempt to slip a comment past, testing boundaries she had once taken for granted. But the calm authority I had demonstrated created a framework for response. I could meet her words with measured resistance, redirect conversations without raising my voice, and most importantly, shield my child from exposure to unnecessary cruelty. The power of calm, deliberate action became apparent every time a potential conflict arose. Her influence diminished in proportion to the clarity and consistency of my boundaries. Reflecting on it now, I understand that this was about more than a single sentence, more than a moment of confrontation. It was about setting a precedent. It was about demonstrating to my daughter that even in the face of cruelty, one can respond with dignity and precision. It was about showing her that worth is inherent, not granted by others, and that boundaries are both a shield and a declaration of self-respect. I also reflected on the subtle satisfaction of seeing her struggle to regain control. Not out of cruelty, not out of vengeance, but as a lesson in the consequences of repeated behavior. A lifetime of small manipulations and quiet undermining could be met with a single calm assertion of truth. And in that realization, I found an almost meditative clarity. Justice does not always arrive in the form of dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it arrives quietly, subtly, and irrevocably through choices made with awareness, principle, and calm precision. As weeks turned to months, I noticed a gradual transformation. The casual digs diminished. The subtle criticisms were less frequent, less impactful, as family members observed her inability to command influence through old tactics. My daughter thrived, surrounded by love, security, and the quiet knowledge that her value could never be diminished by another's words. I could see it in the way she laughed freely, reached for the world without hesitation, and responded to affection without the subtle wariness that comes from feeling measured and judged. The relationship between my mother-in-law and me settled into an uneasy equilibrium. She remained part of our lives, of course, but the power dynamic had shifted. I had claimed the authority to protect my child and my family, and that authority was respected, even begrudgingly. The calm sentence, spoken in a moment of precision, had altered the course of our interactions forever. I began to reflect more broadly on the lessons this experience offered. I realized that family dynamics, no matter how entrenched, are not immutable. Patterns of favoritism, manipulation, and subtle cruelty can be challenged if approached with awareness, preparation, and deliberate action. Anger and confrontation may provide temporary satisfaction, but calm, principle-driven choices carry a lasting impact. Protecting those we love requires strategy as much as courage, and justice, when exercised with clarity, is a quiet, enduring force. In the quiet of my own home, holding my daughter close, I felt a profound sense of peace. The betrayal had come, as inevitable as I had anticipated, but it had been met with preparation, calm, and precision. I had defended what mattered most, and in doing so, I had reshaped the boundaries that would define our family's interactions for years to come. And yet, there remains a lingering question, not just for me, but for anyone who has faced a similar moment. How do you respond when someone you love is belittled? When cruelty arrives under the guise of familial authority, do you meet it with anger, with tears, with retaliation? Or do you, like I did, find the quiet, deliberate sentence that asserts truth, protects innocence, and commands respect without theatrics? I think about it often, and I wonder what others would have done in my place. Would they have reacted differently? Would they have shouted, confronted, or walked away? Or would they, like me, have discovered the profound power in calm, deliberate assertion, the strength in speaking truth, in protecting those we love, in setting boundaries that cannot be crossed? The memory of that afternoon remains vivid, but it no longer carries the sting of fear or the weight of anticipation. It is a reminder of the quiet victories that can be achieved when we act with clarity, integrity, and purpose. And as I watch my daughter grow, free from the subtle cruelties that once threatened her, I carry with me the knowledge that calm, precise action, backed by principle and love, is more powerful than any momentary outburst or fleeting argument. So, I ask you, what would you have done in my place? How do you defend those you love when faced with cruelty in its quietest, most calculated form? Would you have found the strength to remain calm, to assert boundaries with precision, to protect innocence without giving in to anger? Or would the moment have demanded a different kind of response? The answers are not easy. They rarely are. But in that difficult space between expectation and action, we discover not only the depth of our resolve, but the true measure of our courage.